The cold wind bit at Silas's face, a familiar companion in the high peaks where he made his home. Down in the valley, however, the air was thick with dust and the cloying smell of sweat and desperation. He hated the lowlands, hated the press of people and the babble of their meaningless talk. But his draft horse had died, and a man alone in the mountains needed a strong back to pull a plow and haul timber. So he had come. He stood at the edge of the crowd, a monolith of buckskin and solitude, his presence a stark contrast to the jittery energy of the settlement of redemption. Men in dusty hats and women in faded calico gathered for the auction. It was not a formal affair, just a liquidation of assets by a man whose face was as smooth and unpleasant as a river stone. His name was Phineas Thorne, an agent for the railroad, and he moved with an oily confidence that set Silas's teeth on edge. Thorne sold off a plow, a set of harnesses, and a milk cow with practiced ease, his voice a slick patter of promises and figures. Silas waited, his gaze fixed on the powerful Belgian draft horse tethered to a post. It was a good animal, strong and steady. It would do. The past was a frozen lake inside him, a vast expanse of white silence where his wife and daughter had once been. He did not feel, he did not hope. He endured. An animal was a tool, and he needed a tool. After the livestock, Thorne gestured dismissively toward a figure slumped on a crate near the horse. And lastly, part of the property deed, the girl. A murmur went through the crowd. Silas's eyes shifted. The girl was young, perhaps 16 or 17, with a round face smudged with dirt and despair. Her body was soft and full under a dress that was little more than a burlap sack, and her shoulders were slumped in a posture of profound humiliation. She did not look up, her gaze fixed on the splintered wood at her feet. Orphaned, no kin, Thorne announced, as if listing the features of a piece of furniture. Strong enough for work, though. Mending, cleaning, whatever you require. Will be sold as an indentured apprentice until her majority. We'll start the bidding with the horse. Silas felt a tremor in the ice. A faint, terrible echo of another time, another loss. He saw not the girl, but a ghost, the small, bright face of his own daughter, lost to the fever that had swept through his homestead years ago. He pushed the image down, locking it away in the cold vault of his memory. He was here for the horse. Only the horse. Bidding for the Belgian began. Silas let the initial flurry of offers pass, waiting for the weak will to fall away. His hand rested on the pouch of coins at his belt. It was most of what he had, but the horse was worth it. $50, a farmer called out. 55, another countered. As Silas prepared to make his bid, a small, choked voice cut through the air. It was barely a whisper, yet it silenced the entire yard. Please. All eyes turned to the girl. She had lifted her head, her face pale, her eyes wide with a desperate, terrifying courage. They were fixed on him. On Silas. Don't buy the horse, she begged, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. Buy me instead. The crowd gasped. Thorne's face tightened into a mask of fury. He took a step toward her, his hand raised. You be silent. But Silas did not see Thorne. He saw only the girl's eyes, swimming with unshed tears but holding a plea so raw and profound it pierced the layers of ice around his heart. For the first time in 7 years, he felt something other than the dull ache of absence. It was a sharp, protective fire, an instinct he thought had been buried with his family. The farmer who had bid $55 shuffled his feet, looking away. The moment had become too charged, too human. This was no longer a simple transaction. Silas's gaze moved from the girl to the horse, then back again. The horse was a guarantee of survival, a practical necessity. The girl was a complication, a wound, a life thrust into his own. She was a responsibility he had not sought and did not want. He looked at Thorne, whose face was now a pinched knot of greed and irritation. The man saw only assets and liabilities. He saw a nuisance to be disposed of. Silas saw a child. He took a step forward, the crowd parting before him as if he were a force of nature. He ignored the horse completely. His voice, when it came, was low and rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. How much for the girl? Thorn blinked, momentarily thrown. A sly smile then spread across his lips, recognizing a new kind of opportunity. Well now. A man of taste. She is bound by a legal contract of indenture. A valuable asset he was improvising, layering the sale with a veneer of legitimacy. The price, Silas repeated, his tone flat and unyielding. It was not a negotiation. Thorn sized him up, seeing the worn buckskin, the calloused hands, but also the heavy coin pouch. He named a price that was an insult, a sum far greater than the horse's. $100. In coin. A collective intake of breath came from the crowd. It was a fortune. It was exploitation, plain and simple. Silas did not flinch. He did not argue. He untied the leather pouch from his belt, its weight a familiar comfort. Without a word, he poured a cascade of silver and gold coins into Thorn's waiting palm. He did not count them, but he knew the weight. It was everything he had. Thorn's eyes widened as he stared at the pile of money. He quickly closed his fist around it, his greed overriding any other impulse. "She is yours," he declared, his voice thick. He produced a folded paper from his coat, the indenture contract, and scribbled a crude bill of sale on the back. Legal and binding. Silas took the paper without looking at it. He turned to the girl, who was staring at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and terror. He offered her a hand. It was large and rough, scarred by years of hard labor and solitude. She hesitated for a moment, then placed her small, trembling hand in his. Her touch was like a spark on dry tinder. Without another glance at the horse, the money, or the stunned onlookers, Silas turned and led her away from the auction yard. He had come to the lowlands for a tool to help him survive. He was returning to the mountains with a life in his hands. The silence that had defined his existence was now broken, and he did not know if he was ready for the sound. The journey upward was a silent one. Ilara, as he learned her name was from the scrawled document in his pocket, followed a pace behind him. She walked with a clumsy gait, her soft shoes ill-suited for the rocky path that snaked into the high granite peaks. She did not speak, and Silas did not press her. The silence between them was not the peaceful quiet of his solitude, but a taut, fragile thing, stretched thin with her fear and his uncertainty. He could feel her watching him, her gaze on his broad back. What did she see? A savior? A captor? He felt like neither. He was simply a man who had acted on an impulse he did not fully understand. The ghost of his daughter, Sarah, walked with him, a faint shimmer in the cold mountain air. He had failed to protect Sarah from the fever. The thought was a stone in his gut. He would not fail this girl. The resolve was as hard and unyielding as the mountains around them. They reached his cabin as dusk was bleeding purple and orange across the sky. It was a simple structure, built by his own hands from pine and stone, smoke curling from its chimney. It was a fortress against the world, and now he had brought the world into it. He pushed the door open and stood aside, letting her enter first. Her eyes widened as she took in the single room. It was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a fire already crackling within, casting a warm, dancing light over the space. There was a rough-hewn table, a single chair, and a bed built into the wall, covered with thick furs. On the mantelpiece sat a small, carved wooden bird, its paint faded with time. Ilara stood frozen in the center of the room, clutching her arms as if to hold herself together. She looked small and lost beneath the heavy timber beams. Silas moved past her, his motions economical and sure. He ladled stew from a pot simmering over the fire into a wooden bowl and placed it on the table. He added a piece of hard bread beside it. He did not look at her as he spoke, his voice quiet. "Eat." She flinched at the sound, then crept toward the table as if approaching a wild animal. She sat stiffly on the edge of the chair and picked up the spoon with a trembling hand. She ate quickly, ravenously, without looking up. He saw the faint tremor in her hands and knew it was not just from the cold. He took his own bowl and sat on the floor by the fire, giving her space. He ate in his usual silence, the only sounds the crackle of the flames and the scrape of her spoon against wood. When she finished, she placed the bowl back on the table, her eyes darting toward the door. She was a trap bird, looking for an escape. "You are safe here," he said, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. He was not a man for reassurances. He was a man of action. "No one will harm you." She simply nodded, her gaze falling to her lap. He rose and pulled a thick fur blanket from his bed. He laid it on the floor, near the hearth, creating a soft pallet. "This is for you. The fire will keep you warm." He would take the chair. It would not be the first night he had slept sitting up. Her eyes flickered with surprise, and for the first time, a hint of something other than fear. It might have been gratitude. She gave another small, jerky nod. The first few days passed in a similar rhythm of shared silence. Silas went about his chores, chopping wood, checking his trap lines, reinforcing the cabin for the coming winter. Elara stayed inside, a quiet shadow in the corner of his solitary life. She tidied the already clean cabin, her hands finding small tasks to keep them busy. She swept the hearth, folded his spare blanket, and washed their bowls with a meticulous care that spoke of a life spent trying to be unobtrusive. One afternoon, Silas returned from hauling firewood to find her sitting by the cold hearth, tracing patterns in the ash with a stick. They were intricate, swirling designs, images of flowers and birds he had not seen since his wife, Anya, tended her garden. He watched her for a long moment, unseen from the doorway. He saw not a burden, but a person with a quiet, hidden world inside her. That evening, without a word, he placed a piece of charcoal and a clean, smooth sheet of birch bark on the table beside her dinner. He saw the flash of confusion in her eyes, followed by a dawning, fragile hope. She picked up the charcoal as if it were a jewel. Later, as he sat mending a leather strap, he watched her from the corner of his eye. She was completely absorbed, the tip of her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. The scratching of charcoal on bark was a new sound in his cabin, a sound of creation. It was a sound that chipped away another small piece of the ice within him. He glanced at the carved bird on the mantel. Sarah had loved to draw. He had carved that bird for her 5th birthday, the last one she ever had. The memory was a sharp, sudden pain, but for the first time, it was followed not by a wave of cold emptiness, but by a quiet warmth emanating from the girl sketching by his fire. He was protecting this life. It was a purpose, a reason to feel the fire rather than just endure the cold. The peace of the mountains, however, was a fragile illusion. Down in Redemption, Phineas Thorne was nursing a grievance. He had the money, yes, but he felt swindled. The mountain man's silent judgment had pricked his pride, and the girl's public defiance had undermined his authority. More than that, he saw a vulnerability. A man living outside the law, with a girl of questionable legal status, was a man who could be squeezed. Thorne strode into the sheriff's office, his face a mask of practiced concern. "Sheriff Miller, I must report a crime. That brute from the mountains, Silas. He has abducted my ward." Sheriff Miller, a man whose weary posture spoke of a long career navigating the murky line between law and justice, looked up from his paperwork. "Abducted? Mr. Thorne, I was there. He bought her indenture. You took his money. Under duress." Thorne insisted, slamming a fist on the desk. "The man is an intimidating figure. He coerced me. And the girl, Elara, she is simple-minded, easily confused. He has taken advantage of her. The law is clear on matters of guardianship. I have the papers. He produced the indenture contract, waving it like a holy text. I demand you retrieve my property." Miller sighed. He had no love for Thorne, a man who profited from the misfortunes of others. But the paper was legal. On its face, Thorne was the girl's guardian. "I will ride up there, Thorne. I'll talk to him. But I make no promises." A few days later, the need for salt and flour drove Silas down the mountain. He considered leaving Elara behind, but the thought of her alone, defenseless, was untenable. The protective instinct was now a permanent part of him. He also wanted to show her she was not a prisoner. "We are going to town," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Fear fled in her eyes. He will be there. Mr. Thorne. I will be there, too, Silas said simply. It was a promise. In redemption, the air was thick with suspicion. People stared as he walked down the main street, the girl trailing in his wake. They saw a wild man and his strange acquisition. Silas ignored them, his focus on the general store. Inside, a woman with graying hair and kind, intelligent eyes watched them from behind the counter. This was Martha, the store's owner and the town's unofficial conscience. She had known Silas for years as the quiet man who came for supplies twice a year, traded furs, and never wasted a word. Silas, she greeted him, her voice even. Her gaze flickered to Ilara, taking in the girl's fear and the way she stayed close to the mountain man's side. Before Silas could respond, the door swung open and Sheriff Miller entered, Thorne right behind him, a smug look on his face. Silas, the sheriff said, his voice heavy with reluctance. I need to have a word. Thorne here has filed a formal complaint. He has no claim, Silas said, his body tensing, instinctively moving to shield Ilara from view. I have every claim. Thorne sputtered, brandishing his papers. I am her legal guardian. Sheriff, I demand you return her to my custody. Ilara let out a small, terrified whimper. Silas turned his cold gaze on Thorne. She was being sold. Like livestock. I bought her. A transaction you now regret, I'm sure, Thorne sneered. She is a ward of the railroad company until her majority. You are interfering with company property. The sheriff looked torn. Silas, the paper is legal. My hands are tied. It was Martha who spoke up. Legal don't make it right, Henry, she said, her voice sharp. She looked from the terrified girl to Thorne's predatory smirk. I've known this man for 10 years. He's an honest man. And I've known you for 6 months, Thorne. I know your business. You prey on the weak. Thorne's face flushed with anger. This is a matter for the law, not for a shopkeeper's opinions. He turned back to the sheriff. I will give him 24 hours to return her. After that, I will wire the U.S. Marshals and report him for kidnapping. Let's see how his solitary life holds up in a federal prison. The threat hung in the air, heavy and cold. The sheriff looked at Silas, his expression grim. The law was the law, and Thorne was using it like a club. Silas knew he was trapped. He could flee higher into the mountains, but they could not run forever. He had bought her freedom, but he had failed to secure it. He gathered his supplies in silence, paid Martha with a grim nod, and led Ilara back out into the street. The ride back to the cabin was heavier than before, the weight of Thorne's ultimatum pressing down on them. He had one day to find a way to fight a man who wielded the law itself as a weapon. When they returned to the cabin, the sanctuary felt different, violated by the threat that had followed them home. Silas stoked the fire, his movements heavy. He had failed. He would have to send her back. The thought was a shard of glass in his heart. Sending her back to Thorne was a death sentence of the spirit, if not the body. He stared into the flames, the ghost of his daughter whispering accusations in his ear. You couldn't save me. You can't save her. He was so lost in his own bleak thoughts that he didn't hear Ilara approach until she was standing beside him. She was holding the drawing she had made on the birch bark. It was a picture of his cabin, with 2 figures standing in the doorway, a large, broad-shouldered man and a smaller girl beside him. Smoke curled from the chimney into a sky full of stars. It was a picture of a home. I won't go back, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was not the whisper of a victim. It was the low, steady tone of conviction. Silas looked from the drawing to her face. Her eyes were clear, the fear replaced by a cold, hard resolve that mirrored his own. He has the law on his side, Silas said, the words tasting like ash. The law is a liar, then, she replied. Just like him, she took a deep breath. He lies about everything. To everyone. To the railroad, too. Silas turned fully to face her. What do you mean? My father, before he died, he tried to fight Mr. Thorne. Thorne was foreclosing on farms all over the valley, buying them for pennies for the railroad. But my father said he was cheating the company, too. He kept 2 books. The air in the cabin grew still. 2 books? Silas prompted, his mind racing. A ledger, Ilara clarified, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke. One he shows the railroad, with the low prices he pays. But he makes the farmers sign deeds for much less, and he pockets the difference. He keeps a second book, a secret one, with the real numbers. It shows all the money he's stolen. My father saw it once. He told me Thorne keeps it hidden in a false bottom in the floor beneath his desk at the land office in town. Silas stared at her. The lost, frightened girl was gone. In her place was a survivor, one who had paid attention, one who held the key. It was not a club to fight the law, but a blade to cut the man wielding it down to size. Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar feeling, began to stir in his chest. This ledger, he said slowly. It would prove his corruption. It would prove he's a thief to everyone, she confirmed. The railroad, the town, everyone he's hurt. A plan began to form in his mind, sharp and clear. He could not fight Thorne's legal claim on Ilara directly. But if he could expose Thorne as a criminal, his guardianship, his contracts, his entire authority would crumble into dust. To do that, he needed allies. He needed the town of redemption. The next morning, before the sun had crested the peaks, Silas was on his way back down the mountain. He left Ilara at the cabin with a stern instruction to keep the door barred. A silent understanding passed between them. This was their fight now, together. He did not go to the sheriff. Miller was a good man, but a man bound by procedure. Silas needed to win the heart of the town, not just its legal mind. He went first to the blacksmith, a burly man named Gus whose farm had been bought out by Thorne's predecessor. Silas didn't plead or posture. He stood before the glowing forge and laid out the facts of Ilara's story and the existence of the 2 ledgers. Gus listened, his hammer resting on the anvil. Thorne is a snake, he grunted when Silas finished. We all know it. But proving it is another matter. The girl knows where the proof is, Silas stated. But I cannot get it alone. The sheriff won't act without cause. But if the town demands it? Gus looked at Silas, at the raw earnestness in the mountain man's eyes. He picked up his hammer and struck the anvil a mighty blow, the ringing sound a declaration. You have my support. From there, Silas went to the baker, whose flour costs had been driven up by Thorne's control of freight contracts. He spoke to the livery owner, who had lost business. To each, he told the same story. He spoke of a wronged girl and a hidden ledger. He was not asking for a mob, he was building a consensus. He was turning whispers of discontent into a unified voice. His last stop was Martha's store. He told her everything, about Ilara's courage and the secret book. Martha listened intently, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Thorne's power comes from making everyone feel alone, she said. He picks us off one by one. If what that girl says is true, you've given people a reason to stand together. She placed a heavy sack of flour and a slab of bacon on the counter. This is for you. For her. Go on, take it. This town owes you a debt for showing us our own spine. When Silas returned to the cabin, carrying the provisions, he found Ilara had been busy. She had taken one of his torn flannel shirts and, using a needle and thread from a small kit she'd had in her pocket, had mended it with small, neat stitches. It was a simple, domestic act, an act of care. She was making this fortress her home. He placed the supplies on the table. The town will listen, he said. She looked up from her sewing, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time. The light from the fire caught in her eyes, and in that moment, Silas did not see a ward or a victim. He saw a partner. He saw family. The cold emptiness inside him was almost gone, replaced by a fierce, burning warmth. Thorne's deadline was hours away, but Silas was no longer afraid of it. He was ready for the confrontation. The whole town was. The morning of Thorne's deadline dawned crisp and clear. Instead of Silas delivering Ilara to the sheriff's office, a crowd gathered in front of it. It was not an angry mob, but a silent, determined assembly of townspeople. Gus the blacksmith was there, his arms crossed over his massive chest. Martha stood near the front, her expression resolute. The baker, the liveryman, and a dozen other farmers and merchants stood with them. They were waiting. When Sheriff Miller arrived, he stopped, surprised by the turnout. "What is all this?" "We're here for the hearing," Gus said, his voice calm but firm. "The one about Thorne and the girl." Thorne pushed his way through the crowd, his face flushed with triumph. He assumed they were there to see him victorious. "Excellent, Sheriff. An audience. Let's get this over with. I want my ward back." Miller, seeing the mood of the town, knew this could not be handled in his small office. He unlocked the doors to the town hall. "In here," he commanded. "Everyone." The hall filled quickly, the benches creaking under the weight of Redemption's collective conscience. Silas and Ilara entered last. He guided her to a seat at the front, his presence a silent shield. He felt her trembling beside him, but when he glanced down, he saw her hands were clenched into fists in her lap. It was the tremble of resolve, not fear. Sheriff Miller called the meeting to order. "Mr. Thorne, state your case." Thorne stood, oozing self-assurance. He held up the indenture contract. "The case is simple. This document, legally witnessed, makes me the guardian of the orphan Ilara until she comes of age. This man," he pointed a contemptuous finger at Silas, "bought her indenture, true, but he is an unfit guardian. A savage who lives in the wilderness. He is holding her against her will. I am here to reclaim what is legally mine and see that she is cared for properly, as is my duty." He laid his official ledger on the table with a flourish. "My records are all in order, Sheriff. I am an agent of the railroad and a pillar of this community." A few people scoffed, but no one spoke. The room was tense, waiting. "Silas," the sheriff asked. "Your response?" Silas stood. He was not a man of words, and the expectant faces of the townspeople weighed on him. But then he looked at Ilara, at her straight back and determined expression. He was not speaking for himself. He was speaking for her. "He's lying," Silas said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. He turned not to the sheriff, but to the assembled town. "He doesn't see a child. He sees property. Just like he sees your land, your businesses, as things to be consumed." He paused, then looked back at Ilara and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Let her speak. It is her life." All eyes turned to Ilara. She rose slowly from her seat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but Silas's solid presence beside her was an anchor. She thought of her father, of the indignity of the auction block, of the kindness of a stranger who had bought her life back for her. Her voice started as a whisper, fragile and thin. "My name is Ilara. My father was Jacob, and he owned the farm at Willow Creek." She took a breath, and her voice grew stronger, clearer. "Mr. Thorne did not care for him. He cheated him. He used papers with tiny words to steal our land after my mother died and my father got sick." She looked directly at Thorne, whose confident smirk had begun to falter. "He treated me like I was part of the livestock. He told me I was worthless. But he is the worthless one. He is a thief. Slander." Thorne boomed, rising to his feet. "Sheriff, this is nonsense. The girl is emotional, simple." "He keeps 2 ledgers, Ilara said, her voice cutting through his protestations. The hall fell silent. "He has 1 book for the railroad, but he has another, secret book. It holds the real truth. It shows how he pays people one price but reports another, and he keeps the rest. It shows how he stole from my father. How he's stolen from many of you." A loud murmur swept through the room as neighbors looked at each other, their own suspicions suddenly given voice. Ilara's voice rose, filled with the fire of righteous anger. "The truth isn't in the papers he shows you. It's in the ledger he hides. It's in a locked box, under a loose floorboard right beneath his desk at the land office. Thorne's face went white. The specificity of her claim was a dagger. He opened his mouth to deny it, but no sound came out. Sheriff Miller looked from Thorne's panicked expression to Ilara's unwavering gaze. He looked at the faces of his town, united in their demand for justice. He had his cause. He stood and pointed at two sturdy men in the front row, one of them the blacksmith, Gus. I'm deputizing you both. Go with Mr. Thorne to his office. Bring me the box from under his floorboards. You can't! Thorne shrieked, his composure finally shattering. This is illegal. A violation of my property. It's an investigation into a credible accusation of fraud, the sheriff countered, his voice like iron. Go. The defeat was swift and absolute. The deputies returned 20 minutes later carrying a small, heavy metal box. Before the entire town, Sheriff Miller pried it open. Inside was the second ledger. He opened it, and the room was silent as he read a few entries aloud. The name of Gus's farm, sold for a pittance, with a much larger sum recorded as paid by the railroad. The baker's freight contract, with hidden fees listed that never went to the company. It was all there, a meticulous record of Thorne's greed. His corruption was laid bare for everyone he had wronged to see. Thorne crumpled like a paper doll. The law he had used as a shield had turned into a cage. Sheriff Miller walked over and placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. Phineas Thorne, you are under arrest for fraud, extortion, and theft. As Thorne was led away in disgrace, the town hall erupted not in cheers, but in a collective sigh of relief. Justice, for once, had prevailed. The townspeople turned to Silas and Ilara, their eyes filled with a new respect. They saw not a savage and his ward, but two people who had stood up to a bully and won. Martha came forward and wrapped a warm arm around Ilara's shoulders. You were very brave, child. Very brave. Sheriff Miller approached Silas, the now useless indenture contract in his hand. He tore it in half, then in half again. I think this is settled, he said, a rare smile touching his lips. As for guardianship, he looked at Ilara, then at Silas, who stood protectively by her side. Seems to me she's already found her guardian. We can make it official tomorrow. No one will object. Silas looked down at Ilara. Her face was tear-streaked, but she was smiling, a real, radiant smile of relief and victory. He had not just saved her from Thorne, they had saved each other. He had found a reason to fight, and she had found her voice. They left the town hall and walked into the clean, bright sunlight. The people of Redemption nodded to them as they passed, their faces open and friendly. The sack of provisions in their wagon now felt less like charity and more like a welcome. The journey back up the mountain was different again. The silence was comfortable, easy. It was the quiet of shared victory, of a future that was no longer a threat but a promise. Back at the cabin, the late afternoon sun streamed through the single window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Ilara went to the hearth and picked up her piece of birch bark. She found the charcoal and added something new to her drawing of the cabin. She drew a whole field of wildflowers growing by the door. Silas stood in the doorway, watching her. The cabin no longer felt like a fortress of solitude. It felt like a home, waking from a long, cold sleep. He walked over and looked down at her drawing, at the impossible garden she had created. It's a good home, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. Ilara looked up at him, her eyes shining. The last vestiges of fear were gone, replaced by an unbreakable, trusting love. Yes, she said. It is. The mountain man, the girl, and the ghosts of the past had finally found their peace, not in solitude, but together. They had built a family not of blood, but of choice, courage, and a love forged in the fire of injustice. A home built on a foundation of kindness was the strongest fortress of all.